In the early winter of 1883, on the main street of Harlan's Crossing in Caldwell County, Kansas, a man stood in front of 17 children and read aloud from a geography primer while the wind came down off the plains and turned his breath to vapor. He had no building. The building was ash and scorched limestone in the field east of town, still smoking faintly at the corners where the roof beams had fallen in. He had a porch, borrowed that morning without ceremony from a woman named Nora Vance, who ran the dry goods counter inside and had unlocked her front door at 6:30 and simply said he could use what she had. What he had was 12 feet of covered planking, a view of the street and the undivided attention of every person in Harlan's Crossing who happened to be awake and looking out a window. He read for 40 minutes without stopping. When the wind knocked his primer shut, he recited from memory. When a horse tied to the post across the street shied at something and the smaller children looked up, he waited until they looked back, and then he went on. He had come to Caldwell County in September to teach school. He had not come to make a point, or to shame anyone, or to win. He had come because the county board had advertised a position, and he had applied, and they had hired him, and this was what he did. That morning, standing on a borrowed porch with chalk dust still on his coat from the day before, he was doing it. Nobody in Harlan's Crossing had been quite sure what to make of Clayton Fisher when he stepped off the train at the depot on the 1st of September. He was not a large man. He was 28 years old, narrow through the shoulder, with dark eyes set behind the kind of steady expression that gave nothing away and invited nothing in. He carried a leather satchel and a flat wooden case of chalk that he handled with enough care that the depot agent, a man named Gus Tillis, had assumed it held something fragile. It held 144 pieces of chalk in 4 colors. Clayton had counted them on the train. The county superintendent, Howard Ells, met him at the depot in a wagon and told him on the drive out that the school board was pleased to have a man with proper certification, that the county had been 3 years without a permanent teacher, and that the new schoolhouse stood ready on the east side of town, freshly built on land donated by a local cattleman named Dillon Marsh. Howard said Marsh's name the way a man says a name when he wants you to understand the weight of it without having to explain the weight. Clayton noted this and said nothing. The schoolhouse was one room, whitewashed inside, with 8 long benches and a proper blackboard mounted on the north wall. There was a stove in the corner that did not draw well, and a window on the east side that let in the morning light and also the morning wind. Clayton spent the first 2 days of September sweeping it out, fixing the stovepipe with a length of wire, and writing the alphabet across the top of the blackboard in letters even and clean. He was pleased with the building. He said so to Howard Ells, who seemed relieved to hear it. School opened on the 5th of September. 21 children came the first morning, ranging from 6 to 14. Clayton wrote every name in his register. The Halsey children, 2 brothers and a sister from the farm north of town. The Pruitt girl, who was Reverend Aldous Pruitt's youngest and who already read better than most of the older students. 4 children of homesteaders whose names he had not yet learned to pronounce correctly and whose fathers he had not yet met. And 3 children from the Garza family who ran a freighting operation out of the south end of the county, and 2 children from a family named Red Cloud, whose mother was part Cheyenne and whose father worked the mill. Clayton wrote all 21 names in the same ink, in the same column, in the same register. It was this that began the trouble, though the trouble did not announce itself immediately. The first 3 weeks went as school weeks do. The younger children learned their letters. The older ones worked sums. Clayton read to all of them each afternoon from a copy of Natural History he had brought in his satchel, and the room smelled of chalk and wood smoke, and the particular dusty warmth of children sitting still for longer than they wanted. He found them quick, most of them. He found the two Red Cloud children, a boy of 8 and a girl of 10, to be among the fastest with figures he had taught in his 7 years of classroom work. The trouble arrived in the 3rd week of September on a Thursday afternoon in the form of Dylan Marsh himself. Marsh was a man in his middle 50s, broad across the chest, with a rancher's hands and a way of filling a doorframe that was not quite a threat and not quite anything else. He had donated the land for the schoolhouse in 1881, and the county board had thanked him in the minutes of their meeting and had not thought too carefully about what that donation had purchased him in the way of opinion. He came into the classroom at 3 in the afternoon when Clayton was at the board reviewing the day's geography lesson, and he stood in the doorway until Clayton turned and acknowledged him. "I'd like a word," Marsh said. Clayton told the children to copy the map from the board and stepped outside. What passed between them on the steps of the schoolhouse that afternoon took about 4 minutes. Marsh said that certain families in the county were not the kind whose children ought to be mixing with others. He named the Garza children and the Red Cloud children specifically, all 5 of them, and said their presence in the school was not what the board had intended when they built the building. He said this in a level voice, as though he were describing a fence that needed to be moved rather than making a demand of a man he had never met before today. Clayton listened to all of it. Then he said, "They're enrolled. I intend to teach them." Marsh looked at him for a moment. "I donated that land," he said. "You did," Clayton said, "and I'm grateful for the building." He went back inside. He did not tell the children what had been discussed. He picked up the lesson where he had left it and stayed at the board until every student had a fair copy of the map in front of them. He rode the 2 miles back to his rented room at the Tillis house that evening and ate his supper and wrote in the small notebook he kept, recording the day's lessons and which students had needed additional time with particular problems. He wrote nothing about Marsh. He had been through something like this before, not with a fire, but with a school board in eastern Missouri in 1879 that had asked him politely to exclude the 3 Negro children who had enrolled, and when he had refused, had quietly ended his contract and replaced him with a man who would comply. Clayton had been 24 years old, and he had spent the next 3 weeks in his rented room turning the question over, wondering if he had been foolish, wondering if the world simply ran on the terms that men like that board insisted upon. He had come to no particular conclusion, except that he could not do it. He could not look at a child sitting in a classroom with a primer open on the bench in front of them and tell them the room was not theirs to be in. He was not able to arrange himself in a way that made that possible. He had carried that inability with him like a stone in a coat pocket. And here in Caldwell County in October of 1883, it was about to cost him considerably more than a contract. Marsh returned to the schoolhouse twice more in the first weeks of October, once sending a man named Frey, who worked for him, and once coming himself on a Wednesday morning when school was in session. The second time, Clayton was midway through a reading lesson with the youngest students when he heard the door. He did not stop reading. He reached the end of the paragraph, told the children to continue on their own, and went to the door. Marsh said that if the 5 children were not removed from the roll by Friday, there would be consequences. Clayton said, "I hear you." He closed the door and went back to the lesson. The fire was set on the night of October the 14th, a Sunday when the building was empty. Clayton smelled it from the Tillis house before he saw the glow through his window. By the time he reached the east field, the roof was fully engaged. There was nothing to save. Gus Tillis stood beside him in the dark and watched the blackboard go and said something quiet and helpless. 2 other men from town came out with a bucket line that was too late by a quarter of an hour. By morning, what remained was the limestone foundation and the stove, which had survived intact because stone and iron do not burn, and the smell of charred wood that hung over the east end of town for 3 days. Nobody arrested anyone. The county sheriff, a man named Cord Briggs, came out on Monday morning, looked at the ruin, wrote something in a small book, and said he would make inquiries. He made no arrests. In 1883, a cattle operator in Caldwell County who wished to make a point was generally able to make it without much interference from the law, and everyone in town understood that, whether they said it aloud or not. Clayton understood it too. He stood in the ruin on Monday morning for about 20 minutes, looking at the blackened limestone and the collapsed benches, one of which had the carved initials of a Halsey boy on the arm. He thought about the register, which had been inside and which was gone. He thought about the chalk case which he had taken home on Friday. He still had 137 pieces of chalk in 4 colors. He went to find Nora Vance. He had known her for 6 weeks by then, which was long enough to know that she was not a woman who required a long preamble before a request. She was 25, practical in the way that frontier women who run a counter alone tend to be practical, with a younger brother named Amos who had been in Clayton's classroom every morning since the first week of school. Amos was 10 years old and deeply attached to the natural history readings, and Nora had made a point of thanking Clayton for those specifically the second time he came into the store for supplies, saying Amos came home and repeated what he'd heard almost word for word. There was something in the way she said it that was warmer than a standard courtesy, though she delivered it without flourish and moved on to the question of whether he wanted the thick chalk or the thin. He came to the store at 7 in the morning on the 15th of October and told her what had happened, which she already knew, because the whole town knew by sunrise. He asked if he could use the porch. She said yes before he finished the sentence. He went back to the Tillis house, collected his satchel and his chalk, and was on the porch with the primer open at 8 o'clock. 18 children came that first morning, including all 5 that Marsh had named, including Amos Vance with his hands in his pockets and a look on his face that was studiedly casual in the way of a 10-year-old trying not to show that he had thought about whether to come. He came. He sat on the top step with a slate on his knee. The street teaching was not comfortable. There was no shelter from the wind on the east side, and the porch faced west, which meant the afternoon sun came in at an angle that was hard on the eyes. Clayton rigged a length of rope between the porch post and the iron ring on the store's outer wall, and used it to hold his papers when he needed both hands for the board, which was a piece of old shiplap he had found behind the livery and rubbed with coal dust until it was dark enough to take chalk. It was not a blackboard. It served. Nora appeared at the store door each morning before 8 with a tin cup of coffee she left on the railing without a word and went back inside. By the 3rd week, she had strung a canvas awning from the porch roof to a pair of poles set in the ground, which cut the wind on 3 sides and gave the children something that was almost a shelter. She had not asked Clayton's permission to do this. She had simply done it. And when he came the next morning and found it there, he stood looking at it for a moment and then set his satchel down and began the lesson. The town watched. Not all of it approvingly. There were people in Harlan's Crossing who thought Clayton was being stubborn past the point of sense, and there were people who thought the fire itself was not their concern. And there were a few who repeated Marsh's language about which families belonged where. But there were also the parents. The parents of 21 children watched a man stand on a porch in October wind and teach their sons and daughters long division and the capitals of the states and the names of the bones in the human hand. And they did not all agree with him on the question of the 5 children, but they agreed that their own children were learning, and that counted for something. Reverend Aldous Pruitt stopped by on the 2nd Thursday and stood at the edge of the small crowd of observers for a while. His daughter was in the front row with her usual primer. He caught Clayton's eye at the end of the lesson and nodded once, the kind of nod that meant more than courtesy, and walked on. Clayton filed it away. The cold deepened through November. The awning was not enough by mid-month, when the temperature fell to 15 degrees on a Monday morning, and one of the younger Halsey children arrived with his coat frozen stiff at the collar from the ride in. Clayton cut the lesson to 2 hours that morning and sent them home before noon. He walked the Red Cloud children to the mill himself, because it was on his way, and the cold that day was the kind that crept into your chest and stayed. The Red Cloud boy, whose name was Thomas, asked him on the walk whether they were going to have a real building again. Clayton said he believed they would. Thomas said, "When?" Clayton said, "Soon enough." He didn't know if that was true. He said it the way you say a thing to a child who needs a steadier answer than you actually have. By the last week of November, Clayton had spoken to every member of the town council he could find, which was 4 of the 5 members, and had laid out the arithmetic plainly. 21 children without a building, a winter coming on, and a county that collected taxes for educational purposes and was currently providing none. The 4th council member, a dry goods competitor of Nora's named Hugh Sutter, told Clayton that the matter of the schoolhouse would be taken up at the January meeting and that there was no need to be dramatic about it. Clayton said he was not being dramatic. He said he would be on the porch at 8 the next morning regardless, and he was. Nora moved a small cast-iron stove from the back room of the store out onto the porch in early December, a task that involved her and Amos, and a furniture dolly, and a length of stovepipe that did not quite reach the roof line but came close enough to draw. She fed it with scrap wood from the bin behind the livery, which Gus Tillis had agreed to donate after Clayton explained the situation, and the warmth from that small stove turned the awned porch into something that was, if not exactly comfortable, survivable. Children crowded toward it at breaks and held their hands over the iron top. Amos kept the wood box filled without being asked, arriving early each morning with an armload. The blizzard came on the 8th of December, a Saturday, and did not stop until the morning of the 11th. 3 days of horizontal snow and a wind that came straight off the high plains without any obstacle between it and Harlan's Crossing to slow it down. The temperature dropped to 22 below on the second night. Clayton had class on the Monday of the blizzard's second day. He did this because it was a school day, and because the children who came in weather like that were the ones who most needed to come, and also because stopping felt like a concession to something he had no intention of conceding to. 8 children appeared out of the white, including Thomas Red Cloud and his sister, and Amos Vance, who had walked 4 blocks from the Vance house in a coat that was not warm enough and whose eyebrows were frosted when he arrived. Clayton ran that morning's lesson for 90 minutes with all of them pressed close to the little stove and the wind shaking the awning above their heads and occasionally driving a gust of snow through the gap at the east corner. He taught them the water cycle. He had no idea why he chose that particular lesson on that particular morning, except that he had planned it the week before, and he was not a man who discarded his plans without a good reason. When he sent them home at noon, he was already cold through to the back. He packed his satchel, banked the stove, and walked back to the Tillis house. And by the time he arrived, he was shaking in a way that had nothing to do with the wind and everything to do with what was settling into his chest. He put himself to bed and told Gus Tillis, who came to the door with a worried look, that he would be fine by morning. He was not fine by morning. Nora arrived at the Tillis house at dawn on the 11th, while the blizzard was still losing its strength, with a pot of broth and a second quilt from the store's dry goods shelf, and a look that told him she had already decided what was going to happen next, and was not particularly interested in his opinion on the matter. She sat with him through most of that day and the following night. She brought food at intervals, kept the fire, read to him once from the natural history book she had taken from his satchel, which she said she was curious about anyway, and which she had apparently been curious about for some time, because she read it with the ease of someone who had skimmed it before. He had a fever for 4 days. On the second day it was high enough that he was not fully sensible, and later he would recall only pieces of that period. The sound of the stove, the lamplight on the ceiling, her voice reading about the migration of birds through the high plains in autumn, the weight of a second quilt laid over him without ceremony, the smell of the broth. On the third day he came back to himself enough to speak in full sentences, and the first thing he said was that he needed to get back to the porch. She said, "Not today." He said, "Tomorrow." She said, "We'll see about tomorrow." He went back on the 5th day, still hoarse, with a scarf she had pressed into his hands at the door of the Tillis house that morning, and which he suspected was Amos's because it was too short for an adult, though she said nothing about whose it was. If you have ever watched someone do a thing they did not have to do, day after day, without announcement and without asking for acknowledgement, you know that it accumulates in a way that is difficult to name and impossible to dismiss. Clayton Fisher was not a man who spoke easily about what moved him, but he was a man who noticed, and he had been noticing Nora Vance since the first morning she left the coffee cup on the railing without a word. Every morning after that, the awning, the stove, the wood, Amos kept stacked by the door, the broth in the storm, the scarf. He had been filing these things away in the same careful part of himself where he filed the children's progress and the names he had learned to pronounce correctly, and by the time he was well enough to stand in front of his students again on the porch, the file was very full. He said nothing about it. He went on teaching. The town council met in the second week of January 1884. Clayton was not invited to attend the meeting, but Howard Els was, and Howard reported to Clayton the next morning that the vote had gone 5-0 in favor of funding a new schoolhouse to be built on a county lot on the west side of the main street, on land the county itself held, and which nobody could burn down on behalf of someone else's objection. 4 of those 5 votes came from men whose children had stood on that porch in November and December, cold, and learned things. The 5th vote was Hugh Sutter's, who had been predicting the whole time that Clayton would give up and go home, and who had apparently concluded somewhere in the course of watching that he had predicted incorrectly, and adjusted himself accordingly. The county is not a place where a man admits he was wrong in so many words. He votes for the school and goes on with his business, and that is how it is done. Marsh was not at the council meeting. His name did not come up in the recorded minutes. He had made his argument in October by fire, and the town had given him its answer in January by vote, and that was the end of the debate, though nobody framed it in those terms. He went on operating his cattle concern for another decade before he died of a stroke in the winter of 1894, and the county obituary described him as a contributor to local civic life. Clayton read the obituary and did not say anything about it to anyone. The new schoolhouse was framed in March, sided in April, and ready for the desks by the 1st of May. It was a larger building than the first one, with 2 windows on each side, a proper stovepipe and a cloakroom at the back where the children could hang wet coats. The county board had included 4 cases of chalk in the supply order, which Clayton counted on arrival and found to total 360 pieces, more than enough. He stood in the doorway of the finished building on the afternoon of the 1st of May and looked at the blackboard, which was a real blackboard this time, fixed properly to the wall. He stood there long enough that the carpenter who had finished the last of the trim work that afternoon, a man named Durant, came to see what he was looking at. Clayton said he was not looking at anything in particular. Durant said it was a fine room. Clayton said it was. He walked to the dry goods store that evening and told Nora that the building was ready and that he wanted to return the canvas awning, which had been stored in the back of her store since February. She said she did not need it back. He said he thought she might want it for the summer. She said she had 3 awnings and was not short on canvas. He said that was good to know. She said it was. They stood on either side of the dry goods counter with the lamp between them, and there was a particular quality to the quiet in that room on that evening that was different from the particular quality of the quiet in that room on any previous evening, and they both recognized it. He asked if she would like to walk out on Sunday. She said she would. Reverend Aldous Pruitt, who traveled his circuit through Caldwell County on a schedule that could be predicted within about a week in either direction, arrived in Harlan's Crossing on the 3rd Sunday of June, 1884, which was a warm morning, and performed a wedding ceremony on the steps of the new schoolhouse. The witnesses were Howard Ells, Gus Tillis, Amos Vance, and the 5 Halsey, Garza, and Red Cloud children who had been playing in the field behind the building and had wandered over when they saw people gathering. Pruitt read from his small book, asked the necessary questions, received the necessary answers, shook Clayton's hand, accepted a supper invitation from the Vance house for that evening, and departed the next morning on his circuit horse, which was a gray animal named for a town he had passed through in Missouri that had treated him well and that Pruitt spoke of often. Nora wore a dress the color of river grass that Amos said looked green, and she said was more of a sage, and the argument about this between them lasted through the ceremony and into supper, which was the kind of argument that sustains a family for years. Clayton Fisher taught school in Harlan's Crossing for 31 years after that June morning. He taught children who grew up and sent their own children to him, and he taught their children too in the later years, which meant that by 1914 there were adults in Caldwell County who had been taught by Clayton and whose first memories of school were of a man standing on a porch in October wind with chalk dust on his coat. Some of them told this story at gatherings, and some of them told it to their children, and some of them simply held it without telling it, the way you hold a thing that shaped you. The 5 children Marsh had wanted dismissed grew up and went various ways. The Garza children took over their father's freighting concern, which expanded to 3 wagons and a crew of 8 by 1895. Thomas Red Cloud became a surveyor and worked county land claims across the territory for 20 years. His sister moved east, trained as a nurse, and worked the influenza wards in 1918 with a steadiness that the supervising physician mentioned in a letter to her family. Amos Vance taught school. He started in 1895 when he was 22 years old in a 1-room school in the northwest corner of the county, and he taught there for 14 years before taking a post in the county seat, where he stayed until he retired. He had, his students would later say, an unusual ability to make children feel that the room was theirs, and the lesson was for them specifically, and that the material was worth attending to. He had learned this somewhere. He knew where he had learned it. Clayton and Nora had 3 children of their own, 2 daughters and a son, and the son taught briefly before moving to Colorado, and the daughters settled in Kansas and raised families, and the house they built on the east side of Harlan's Crossing, on a lot Clayton bought with 4 years of teaching wages, became the kind of house that people in the county refer to by the family name when giving directions. The Fisher's Corner, they said. Turn at the Fisher's Corner. Nora ran the dry goods store until 1907, when her eyes began to give her trouble with the small print on the invoices, and then she handed it to a young woman from the south end of the county who had worked the counter for 2 years and knew the inventory well. She did not stop working. She simply changed what she worked at. She kept the household accounts and the kitchen garden and, in the later years, the correspondence with the children and grandchildren, which she wrote in a hand that remained precise and clear well into old age. Clayton was not a man who talked much about the year of the fire and the street teaching. When people asked him, and they did ask, particularly in the later years when it had become a kind of county legend, he was likely to describe the details plainly: the chalk case, the awning, the stove, the November wind, and then stop, as if the story's meaning was visible in the details and did not need to be pointed out. He never named Marsh as a villain. He described what had happened with the same level voice he had used to describe the burned ruin the morning after the fire, and left the listener to form their own conclusions. He was not a man who needed to gloat. He was not a man who needed to be told he had been right. The schoolhouse stood and the children had come, and that was the thing itself, and everything else was commentary. The hard places in a life do not announce what they are making of you. You find out later when the work holds or does not hold, and by then the making is already done. Clayton retired from teaching in the summer of 1914, when he was 59 years old, and his knees had begun the long complaint that would occupy his last years. His last day in the classroom was a Friday in June, and it ended the way all his days ended, with the children copying the next day's assignment from the board and filing out through the cloakroom and collecting their coats from the pegs where they had hung them in the morning. He stayed until the last one was gone, and then he cleaned the blackboard with the felt eraser and set the chalk in the tray and locked the door behind him. He died in the winter of 1916 in the house on the east side of town, with Nora beside him and the fire in the stove and the cold wind against the east-facing window, the same as it had been on every December night of his adult life in that county. Nora had him buried on the ridge above the schoolhouse, on a parcel of county land that the board had set aside for the purpose years before, at Clayton's request, which he had made once, quietly without explanation, and which the board had granted without asking for one. The view from the ridge was the full length of the valley, and in clear weather, the dark line of the hills to the west, where the county gave out and the next territory began. In spring, the wildflowers came up through the grass on that ridge and stayed through July. Nora visited on Sundays when the weather allowed it. If you have ever known someone who simply refused to stop doing the thing that needed to be done, regardless of what was burned or blown down or taken from them, you know what Harlan's Crossing had in Clayton Fisher, and what it almost let Dylan Marsh take away. We would love to hear from you below. Was there a teacher in your own life who held the room open when someone wanted it closed? Tell us in the comments. Amos Vance taught for 37 years in Caldwell County, and when he retired, he was given a supper by the county board and a framed certificate and a small speech by the superintendent, who said that Amos had shaped more minds than most men dared to count. Amos thanked them and sat down and thought, as he often did on formal occasions, about a morning in October 1883, when he had walked 4 blocks in a coat that was not warm enough and sat on a porch step with a slate on his knee, while the wind came down off the plains and a man read aloud from a geography primer and did not stop. He could still feel the cold of that step. He could still hear the man's voice carrying over the wind, level and clear, and entirely untroubled by the fact that there was no building around it. In the county historical register, kept at the courthouse in Harlan's Crossing, there is a photograph taken in the spring of 1885, 1 year after the new schoolhouse was built. It shows 34 children arranged on the steps and in the yard, with a man standing at the back left who has chalk on his coat and a look of quiet attention on his face, as though something in the near distance has caught his notice, and he is deciding whether it is worth remarking upon. He decided apparently that it was not. He went on teaching.